Yeah. Okay. Well, it appears, I'm afraid, that there is a camera problem. Let's keep going, and if the team can bring up the camera, that would be great. So, conversion therapy laws. There's been a kind of epidemic of them in the last few months, last year or 18 months in particular. And one of the questions I want to talk about is why. The argument is that there's an issue about conversion therapy. But as Bronwyn said in her introduction, the kinds of things we talk about as conversion therapy, aversion to same-sex pictures, this kind of thing, they disappeared from psychiatry in the 1980s sometime. There were some Christian groups, particularly in the United States. There was Exodus, which went on for a while with Christian forms of prayer therapy and so on. But by and large, the attempts to change somebody's sexual orientation have long since disappeared. There's an acceptance that there may be some development and change through adolescent years, but there comes a point at which somebody's sexual orientation can be quite fixed. But notwithstanding that, there's been this urgency to have conversion therapy laws. We've seen them in Queensland, that was 2020, then the ACT, and then 2021 in Victoria. And Victoria is the most extreme of the Australian laws. They could be sentenced to imprisonment for up to 10 years in certain circumstances. Now, let me emphasize the Victorian law, the prosecution would have to prove quite a lot before it could get that conviction. But there's also powers of administrative bodies to investigate professionals. It's quite a threatening piece of legislation. And this is all under consideration in the other states, South Australia, Western Australia, and of course, Tasmania. The Tasmanian Law Reform Institute produced what was a very controversial issues paper at the beginning of last year and have been silent since. There was quite an adverse reaction to it. But we've seen these laws passed in New Zealand. Just a few weeks ago, we've seen them passed in Canada. If you think Victoria is extreme, you should look at Canada and many US states. And the whole time, the claim is that we need to have these laws to prevent the harm of conversion therapy. But all the justifications that you hear rely on discredited therapies to alter same-sex attraction. You almost never hear serious examples being given about discredited therapies to do with gender identity. And what's going on here? It seems that they are using the discredited, outdated, long since disappeared therapies to do with same-sex attraction to form a platform for saying we should outlaw certain therapies in regard to gender identity. And this is a real concern. So what is conversion therapy? I'm sorry you don't have my slides so they can be made available by the organizers. But it's a practice that attempts to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, whether or not by request or consent. And that's a really important thing to emphasize. That can you see me now? Can you see me now, people, folks? Hello.
Yes.
Okay, we might be winning. Okay, I'm going to share screen. Can you see the screen now? Bronwyn, how are we doing? Can you see the screen now? Yeah. Okay, I'll keep going. I'm going to assume that you can see the screen. So the legislation refers to conversion therapy as a practice that attempts to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, whether or not by request or consent. You can have a 50-year-old man, 50-year-old woman who seeks help, and yet it could be unlawful to respond to that request. That's so in all of the Australian laws and elsewhere. But only Queensland actually gives any examples. Queensland gives the examples of inducing nausea, vomiting, or paralysis while showing the person's same-sex images. These are shocking treatments which has, as far as I know, long since died out. I haven't heard anybody claiming that in recent years health professionals have been using such treatments, or indeed other people. Using shame or coercion to give the person an aversion to same-sex attractions. And then you see the words, or to encourage gender-conforming behavior. Well, can we not be male or female in all sorts of different ways? That's one of the issues about the vague language of encouraging gender-conforming behavior. And then using other techniques on the person, encouraging the person to believe that being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or intersex is a defect or disorder. I've never heard anybody claiming that being intersex is a defect or disorder. It's a natural variation in the human form. But these are the sorts of things. Most of the other jurisdictions don't even attempt to give examples. But to the extent that Queensland does, you can see it's based upon therapeutic practices which largely disappeared in the 1980s to try to cure same-sex attraction. Well, what we have now is a problem of definition inflation. This is a very common technique in social justice advocacy, that you take a word that something of which everybody disapproves. We approve of domestic violence. All of us do, I hope, all of us should. But then the meaning of that becomes ever more expanded. The word violence generally has been used in all sorts of contexts which go way beyond the imposition of physical force by way of an assault. So you take a word, you take its disapproval, you take its emotional effect, and this picks up Holly's talk as well, and then you say all these other things are included in this as well. So the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute engages in massive definition inflation in its issues paper. The Queensland law focused on therapeutic techniques. It focused upon actions by health professionals. But the working definition of the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute is that conversion therapy includes acts or statements that are aimed at changing, suppressing, or eradicating the sexual orientation or gender identity of another person. Notice that word statements, because when you then read on as to what they mean by that, they seek to include all sorts of activities which are not therapy, which are not practices similar to the aversion therapy of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and which had died out by the mid-1980s. They also say it includes the making of false and misleading claims about the physical or medical causes of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, this is quite alarming, because if we take sexual orientation, and I know this is a very diverse audience in Hobart, but look at the science on sexual orientation, and there's quite a lot of different disagreement between experts as to why a same-sex orientation develops in a person. There are genetic and hormonal explanations, there are environmental and other explanations. When we come to gender identity, there's a huge controversy about the etiology, the origins of gender incongruence, to use a neutral term. And Diana spoke about these to some extent. There is a belief that you can be born in the wrong body, but actually the scientific evidence for that is not very strong. There are some indications from twin studies and this kind of thing that there could be a genetic factor, a hormonal factor in terms of influences in the womb and so on. But it's far from scientifically established. Most experts would agree that if there is a biological component, then it's taken with a lot of other factors, environmental and social, that impact upon somebody to cause gender incongruence. So we have a scientific and medical debate about these things. But the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute wants to ban false or misleading claims about the physical and medical causes of sexual orientation or gender identity, as if the science were settled. You see how dangerous, if I may say so, this is. The idea that quite unscientific beliefs will be backed up by the criminal law. When we come to gender identity, there are powerful reasons to think that trauma could be a factor. Very large percentage of all those who go to gender clinics seeking help are on the autism spectrum, which suggests there's a neurobiological aspect to all of this. There's also been recent research from Westmead Children's Hospital in Sydney showing that child abuse, family dysfunction, disordered attachments, the psychologists talk about, these are also highly represented in the cohort of people seeking help for gender dysphoria. So you cannot rule out at all psychological explanations and the impact of trauma, adverse childhood events in understanding the phenomenon of gender incongruence. And yet we have the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute expanding the definition to statements which, in the views of whoever wrote that document, represent false and misleading claims about the science. It's also a deeply anti-religious document. I speak as a Christian myself. I was quite offended by the depth of hostility that I could read in the document towards people of faith, notwithstanding that there were passages which talked about religious freedom. One of the things which counted as possible conversion therapy is encouraging people to go to prayer groups or Bible studies, or viewing and listening to sermons that take a particular view of sexual orientation or gender identity. These could be conversion therapy, according to at least the text of that issues paper. So you see how widely this goes, whatever you may believe about these things. And then there's confusion at the very heart of the whole transgender movement. Is gender identity something innate, or is it fluid? The assumption behind these laws is that gender identity is immutable and cannot be changed, and therefore any therapy aiming to change it must be banned by criminal law, and people should be threatened with jail if they engage in that therapy. And yet, gender experts will tell you that gender is fluid. This is a quote from Hidalgo and colleagues, 4 gender clinic experts writing in the United States in 2013. Gender may be fluid, they say, and is not binary, both at a particular time and if and when it changes within an individual across time. Now, maybe they were talking about children who have a very comfortable sense of being a boy or a girl, and then in their adolescent years develop gender incongruence. But if gender is fluid, it can be fluid in more than one direction. It could be fluid back towards comforting your gendering. So there's a fundamental confusion at the very heart of the whole movement about whether gender is innate, immutable, fixed, or fluid. There's also a debate at the heart of the movement as to whether gender is immutable, fixed, assigned at birth, or socially constructed. Bernadette Wren, one of the leading clinicians in the Tavistock in London, has written very thoughtfully about the disconnect between her view that gender is socially constructed and the claims of her young clients that they were born in the wrong body. And then we see the incoherence in Victoria and Tasmania's self-ID laws. Both laws say that you cannot apply to change your gender identity more than once every 12 months. But you can change it after 12 months. How can gender identity be immutable if you're allowed to change it as often as every year? And remember, each change is a change to your birth certificate. It's engaging in a fiction that if I, at the age of 24, declare myself to have been born female, that we change my birth certificate to reflect that belief. And then you change it again if that belief changes. So there's incoherence at the very heart of all of these things. Now, under these conversion therapy laws, not all therapy is banned. It's okay if it's a practice or conduct that in the health service provider's reasonable professional judgment is necessary to provide a health service. That's Victoria and the ACT. In Queensland, in the provider's reasonable professional judgment, is part of the clinically appropriate assessment, diagnosis, or treatment of a person. But notice in Victoria and the ACT, the word necessary. And that may be a really real limiting factor in terms of what the profession and the courts allow. Yes, you engaged in therapy, but was it necessary? That might be a question which people disagree. And it's okay to assist someone considering a gender transition. It's okay under these laws even to explore gender identity. But what about people who are detransitioning? Is that conversion therapy? If you're helping a young woman who's gone through cross-sex hormone treatment with a deepened voice, a double mastectomy, having made irreversible changes to her body, and you're helping her therapeutically now to adjust to acknowledging that she is now and always was a woman. Is that conversion therapy? We don't know. And so the question is, what justifies these criminal penalties? In relation to gender identity, there is no credible evidence from any study I have seen of harm from any therapeutic practice. Diana Kenny talked about the well-established research that most children going to gender clinics in the past, mainly boys, resolve their gender confusion, their gender incongruence by the time they go through puberty, by the time they've gone through puberty. 75% or so resolve their gender incongruence. There are some who don't, and they go on to become adults in the main who are gay or lesbian. But there's no clear evidence in the literature of any harm from any of these treatments. One study has been comprehensively debunked by Robert D'Angelo and colleagues in Australia. And in all the discussion about these conversion therapy laws, and you can see this in the Tasmanian report, you can see it in all the other debates, nobody quite tells you what is the therapy they want to ban. We understand that aversion therapy, inducing nausea to try to help people move away from same-sex attraction, that's appalling. We understand that's a therapy which you might want to ban, but it's long since disappeared. But what is the therapy they want to ban in terms of gender identity? Nobody can say. It's just conversion therapy is a dreadful thing, therefore we should ban it. And they're not quite sure what it is that they want to ban. And yet therapy is practiced by some of the world's leading gender clinics. There's a paper by two clinicians from the Tavistock in London, where they worked with 12 young people who came with gender dysphoria, diagnosed gender dysphoria, who wanted treatment to change their bodies. And through counseling, they found a different way to reconcile their feelings with their biological sex. So are we going to ban the work of gender clinics in counseling? This is incoherent stuff, utterly incoherent. So in summary, laws are being passed threatening mental health professionals and others with jail for practicing conversion therapy, but nobody knows exactly what it is they want to ban. There's no science to support the idea that gender identity is immutable and cannot be changed. I agree, it may be for some people. Men in particular who transitioned into a female identity, often in midlife, will report years and years of difficulty and confusion. One only has the greatest of sympathy and concern for them. So for some people, yes, it does seem to be immutable. It does seem to be a permanent thing. But to say that is so of all gender identity is simply unscientific. There's a mountain of evidence to the contrary. And yet there's this urgency to pass these laws whipped up by activists. The problem is this, friends, it has a chilling effect. Many young people now seeking to transition medically have serious psychiatric comorbidities. That's a technical term for saying they have serious illnesses which sit alongside the gender dysphoria. And Diana Kenny talked about some of those. Large numbers are on the autism spectrum. Others have histories of trauma, as I've explained, and dissociative, attachment disorders. There's also other clinical psychiatric problems as well. And the serious risk is that if they present to a psychologist or psychiatrist with gender dysphoria, they will not get help because the laws are threatening that mental health professional with jail if he or she engages with the underlying issues in that young person's life, which may be causing their sense of gender incongruence. There's already anecdotal evidence that I'm hearing around Australia of psychologists and psychiatrists turning clients away because they're worried by these laws. It's just better not to engage. Why would you risk it? Why would you risk being struck off by your profession to help somebody? There's so many clients queuing up outside the door wanting help. Why would you risk it to help this troubled young person who might turn around in a year or two and accuse you of conversion therapy? And so my concern, and I say this with all seriousness, is that we could see with these laws an increase in suicide of young people, an increase in poorer mental health for a very vulnerable population. And if we care about these young people who are flocking to gender clinics, saying that they are trans, if we care about them deeply, we will not pass these conversion therapy laws. Thank you.